The sound in the headset was the only thing between the pilot and the mountain. It was February 1938, somewhere over the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, and the airmail pilot, a man whose name the records do not preserve because airline records of the late 1930s are incomplete and airmail pilots died with a regularity that made individual record-keeping impractical, was flying a Ford trimotor at 7,000 feet through clouds so thick he could not see the propellers on his own engines. The temperature outside was below freezing. Ice was forming on the wings. The airspeed indicator was fluctuating because ice was building on the pitot tube. He had no visual reference to the ground. He had no radar. Radar did not exist in civilian aviation. He had no GPS. The concept would not be imagined for another 40 years. He had no inertial navigation. That was a technology for submarines, not airplanes. What he had was a pair of headphones and a sound. The sound was a steady hum, a continuous tone, monotonous and featureless, playing in both ears from the aircraft's radio receiver. As long as the hum remained steady, the pilot was on course. He was flying along an invisible line in the sky, a corridor of radio energy roughly 3 degrees wide that stretched from the radio station behind him to the radio station ahead of him. If he drifted to the left, the steady hum would break apart and he would begin to hear a pattern, dit-da, 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 the Morse code letter A repeating endlessly. If he drifted to the right, the pattern would change, da-dit, 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 the letter N. His job was to keep the hum steady. Left meant A, right meant N, steady meant safe. He was flying the beam. This was the low-frequency radio range, the first electronic navigation system in the history of aviation, the invisible highway that connected American cities with corridors of sound, the technology that made it possible for a pilot to fly from New York to Chicago at night, in cloud, in rain, in snow, without ever seeing the ground. It was simple, it was crude by modern standards, it was sometimes unreliable, and it saved more lives than any technology in the first 30 years of powered flight. Before the beam, pilots navigated the way sailors had navigated for millennia. They looked at the ground. In good weather, visual navigation was straightforward. A pilot flying from Cleveland to Pittsburgh followed the railroad tracks, literally, physically followed the iron rails that connected the two cities, because railroads ran through valleys and around mountains and into the hearts of cities, which was exactly where the airports were. Pilots called this method iron compass flying, and it worked well enough during the day, in clear weather, over terrain that had recognizable features. Rivers, lakes, highways, railroad junctions, distinctive buildings, water towers with city names painted on them. These were the landmarks that pilots used to know where they were. At night, the landmarks vanished. In cloud, the landmarks vanished. In rain, in fog, in the snow squalls that swept across the Great Plains and the mountain passes with little warning, the visible world disappeared and the pilot was alone in a featureless void with nothing to tell him whether he was over farmland or heading into the side of a ridge. The first solution was fire. In the 1920s, the U.S. Post Office and later the Department of Commerce built a network of airway beacon lights, rotating searchlights mounted on steel towers, spaced roughly every 10 miles along the major airmail routes, stretching from New York to San Francisco. At night, a pilot could follow these beacons the way a mariner follows a chain of lighthouses. The beacons rotated, flashing a distinctive pattern that identified each station. Between the major beacons, smaller course lights marked the route. Emergency landing fields, lit by floodlights, were positioned along the airways for pilots who could not reach the next airport. The beacon system made night flying possible. It did not make it safe. A rotating light on a tower is useless when the cloud ceiling drops below the height of the mountains. A pilot following beacons through clear air at 8,000 feet could, within minutes, find himself in cloud that obliterated every light on the ground. At that point, he was flying blind. No visual reference, no instruments capable of telling him his position, no way to know whether the terrain ahead was flat or rising, whether the valley he thought he was following had narrowed into a canyon, whether the mountain he expected to be on his left was in fact directly ahead. The death rate among airmail pilots in the 1920s was staggering. In the first 4 years of transcontinental airmail service, 31 pilots were killed, roughly 1 death for every 100,000 miles flown. Many of them died because they flew into terrain they could not see. The mountains of Pennsylvania, the Rockies, the Sierras, the Wasatch Range, these were the killing grounds, and they killed because the pilots had no way to navigate when the weather took the ground away from them. The technology that would change this was not a beacon and not a compass. It was a sound. The idea of using radio for aerial navigation had been circulating since before the First World War. In 1907, a German engineer named Otto Scheller conceived a radio beacon using 4 vertical antennas that created 2 overlapping figure-8 signal patterns, one broadcasting a Morse code dot, the letter E, the other broadcasting a dash, the letter T. Where the 2 patterns overlapped and the signals merged, a pilot would hear a steady tone. Scheller's idea was the seed. It would take 20 years and the deaths of dozens of pilots before it grew into a system. In the United States, the Bureau of Standards, the government's primary research laboratory, began working on radio navigation for aircraft in the early 1920s. Scientists named Percival Lowell, Francis Dunmore, and Francis Engel developed a directive-type radio beacon using 2 compact loop antennas to create a 4-course system. The key innovation was the use of 2 interlocking Morse code signals, not E and T as Scheller had proposed, but A, dit da, and N, da dit. These 2 letters were chosen because they are exact complements. When you interleave them, the dits of the A fill the gaps between the das of the N, and the result is a continuous, unbroken tone. Where the A signal and the N signal were of equal strength, where their patterns overlapped, a pilot would hear that continuous tone. Where one signal was stronger than the other, the pilot would hear the dominant letter. The result was a radio station that divided the sky into 4 quadrants. 2 quadrants broadcast A, 2 broadcast N. The boundaries between the quadrants, 4 narrow corridors where the signals merged into a steady tone, were the beams, the courses, the invisible highways. The Ford Motor Company built the first commercially workable application of this technology, but it was the Bureau of Standards and later the Bureau of Air Commerce that developed the system into a national network. By 1928, the first operational radio range stations were being installed along the Federal Airways. By 1932, 20 stations were in operation. By 1940, the network had grown to over 400 stations covering the continental United States, with additional stations in Alaska, Hawaii, and along the major overseas routes. The network of rotating beacon lights, the chain of fires in the sky that had guided the first airmail pilots, was gradually relegated to a backup role. The primary means of navigating the American airways had become a sound in a pair of headphones. Pilots called it the range, not a range, the range, as if there were only one. And in a sense, there was. A single, interconnected system of stations, each one broadcasting on a unique frequency, each one creating 4 courses that connected to the courses of adjacent stations, forming a web of invisible pathways that covered the country. The Federal Airways, designated with color names and numbers like green 3 or amber 7, were not lines drawn on a map. They were sonic corridors, defined by radio, existing only in the electromagnetic spectrum, audible only through a receiver, navigable only by ear. Flying the beam was not easy. It was a skill that required training, concentration, and a tolerance for monotony that bordered on the pathological. The pilot's radio receiver, a simple AM set with vacuum tubes that took 10 to 30 seconds to warm up, was tuned to the frequency of the nearest radio range station. Each station broadcast a continuous identifying signal in Morse code, 3 letters repeated at intervals that told the pilot which station he was receiving. Once identified, the pilot listened for the steady tone that indicated he was on one of the 4 courses. If he heard A, he was in an A quadrant. If he heard N, he was in an N quadrant. If he heard the steady tone, he was on the beam. But knowing you were on the beam did not tell you which beam you were on. Each station had 4 courses, and all 4 sounded exactly the same. A pilot hearing the steady tone could be flying north, south, east, or west from the station. To determine which course he was on, the pilot had to perform a series of orientation maneuvers, deliberate turns and heading changes that allowed him to identify the quadrant on each side of the beam. If he turned left and heard A, and turned right and heard N, he knew which course he was following. If the signal was getting stronger, he was heading toward the station. If it was getting weaker, he was heading away. Directly over the station, there was a zone of silence, the cone of silence, where the radio signal faded to nothing. This was both disorienting and useful. It was disorienting because the pilot suddenly lost the only reference he had. It was useful because it told him unambiguously that he was directly over the station. A small marker beacon transmitting on a separate frequency confirmed station passage with a distinctive signal. The pilot crossed the cone of silence, picked up the outbound beam on the other side, and continued to the next station. The process repeated across the country, station to station, beam to beam, steady tone to cone of silence to steady tone again. A flight from Newark to Chicago might traverse 8 or 10 radio range stations, with the pilot retuning the receiver at each one, re-identifying the station, re-establishing the beam, and reorienting to the correct course. The entire flight was conducted by ear, hour after hour of listening to a sound that was simultaneously the most boring and the most critical thing the pilot had ever heard. The monotony was dangerous. A pilot who allowed his concentration to lapse, who stopped listening, who let the faint drift from steady tone to faintly perceptible A or N pass without correction, could wander off course by miles before he noticed. At cruise altitude over flat terrain, a few miles of drift was recoverable. Over mountains, a few miles of drift was the distance between a beam that followed a safe valley and a ridgeline at 7,000 feet that the pilot could not see. The beam itself was not always where it was supposed to be. Low-frequency radio signals are affected by terrain, weather, and ground conductivity. Mountains reflected the signal. Coastlines bent it because the conductivity of seawater differs from the conductivity of land, and the beam deflected at the boundary. Cities with large steel-framed buildings distorted the pattern. Thunderstorms produced electromagnetic interference that turned the steady tone into a crackling hash of static that obscured both the A and the N. In the worst conditions, a winter night over the Alleghenies with a frontal system passing through, the beam could shift by several degrees from its charted position, creating a false course that led the pilot not along the valley, but into the ridge beside it. The physical stations themselves were modest installations that belied their importance. A standard radio range station consisted of 4 antenna towers arranged in a diamond pattern, typically spaced a few hundred feet apart in an open field near an airport or along an airway. The towers were guide steel masts, similar to radio broadcast towers but smaller, 50 to 150 feet tall depending on the terrain and the frequency. 2 pairs of towers, one pair broadcasting the A signal, the other broadcasting the N signal, were connected to a transmitter building at the center of the diamond. The transmitter, which operated at frequencies in the 200 to 400 kHz range, was modest by broadcast standards. A few hundred watts of power, enough to produce a usable signal at ranges of 50 to 100 miles, depending on terrain and atmospheric conditions. The station was staffed around the clock by Civil Aeronautics Authority technicians who monitored the transmitter, maintained the antennas, and broadcast weather observations and airway traffic advisories. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, in a role that was neither glamorous nor well compensated, were the invisible backbone of the airways system. They calibrated the transmitter daily, checked the antenna patterns periodically, and reported any signal anomalies that might affect aircraft navigation. A radio range station that went off the air, from equipment failure, from power outage, from storm damage to the antenna, created a gap in the airway that forced pilots to navigate by dead reckoning across the missing segment, a prospect that was merely inconvenient in clear weather and genuinely dangerous in instrument conditions. The later stations used adcock antennas, vertical monopoles rather than loop antennas, which were less affected by the vertical component of radio waves that caused errors at certain times of day. The adcock design improved the beam stability and reduced the false courses that had plagued the earlier loop-type installations. But even the best adcock station was still a low-frequency system, still susceptible to atmospheric noise, still limited to 4 courses, and still navigable only by ear. Training pilots to fly the beam was a challenge that multiplied exponentially when the war came. In peacetime, a pilot learned to fly the beam gradually, first in ground school, then in an aircraft with an instructor, then on supervised solo flights in fair weather, then in increasingly challenging conditions as his experience and confidence grew. The process took months. A pilot who could reliably fly the beam in instrument conditions was a pilot who had hundreds of hours of experience and a relationship with the radio range that was almost intuitive. He could sense a drift from the beam before the A or N became distinctly audible, correcting with a touch of aileron that was more reflex than calculation. The war did not allow months. The Army Air Forces needed thousands of instrument-rated pilots immediately, and the training program that produced them was, by necessity, compressed to the minimum. Student pilots learned the theory of the radio range in ground school, practiced beam tracking in link trainers, the primitive flight simulators of the era, wooden boxes with stubby wings that sat on a pedestal and replicated the motions of an aircraft in response to the students' control inputs, and then flew actual beam approaches after a few hours of practice. Many of them were sent into combat with instrument skills that peacetime standards would have considered barely adequate. The result was predictable. Navigation errors during the war were frequent. Aircraft got lost. Pilots followed the wrong beam. Pilots flew past the cone of silence without recognizing it and continued outbound when they should have been inbound. Pilots confused one station's frequency with another's and followed a beam that led them to the wrong airport, or, in the worst cases, into terrain that was nowhere near any airport. The low-frequency radio range demanded skills that took years to perfect, and the war gave pilots weeks. The attrition was absorbed. The system worked well enough, often enough, for enough pilots to reach their destinations safely that the airways continued to function. But the margin between adequate and fatal was thinner than anyone wanted to acknowledge, and every pilot who flew the beam during the war knew, even if he would not admit it, that his survival owed as much to luck as to skill. The Germans had their own beam systems, and they used them with devastating effect, until the British learned to fight back. The Knickebein system, literally crooked leg, used intersecting radio beams to guide German bombers to their targets over England. The pilot flew along one beam until it intersected with a second beam, at which point the bombardier released his bombs. The system was crude by the standards of the later war, but in 1940 and 1941, it gave the Luftwaffe the ability to bomb British cities at night with a precision that the British initially could not explain. The attacks seemed too accurate for blind bombing, and it was months before British intelligence, led by the physicist R.V. Jones, identified the Knickebein beams and developed countermeasures that bent the German signals, causing bombers to release their loads over open countryside instead of over the cities they were aiming for. The Germans responded with more sophisticated systems, the X-Garret and Y-Garret, that used higher frequencies and more complex timing mechanisms to improve accuracy. The British countered each one. The electronic war over the beams that guided bombs to cities, and the countermeasures that deflected them was one of the first electronic warfare campaigns in history, fought not with guns, but with transmitters, receivers, and the mathematical understanding of radio wave propagation. The irony was that both sides were using the same fundamental principle that the low-frequency radio range had established in the 1920s, an invisible path of radio energy that an aircraft could follow through the sky. The Americans used it for navigation, the Germans used it for bombing, the British used countermeasures to corrupt it. The principle was the same, the applications were diametrically opposed, and the outcome of the Beam War, which the British won decisively by 1942, demonstrated that radio navigation was not just a tool for finding your way, it was a weapon, and like any weapon, it could be turned against you. Then the war came, and the range went with it. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Army Air Corps had plans for approximately 500 officers trained in navigation. 500. For an air force that would, within 4 years, expand to over 2 million personnel and operate tens of thousands of aircraft across every ocean and every continent. The navigational training infrastructure was utterly inadequate for what was coming. The low-frequency radio range was a domestic system. It covered the continental United States with reasonable density, over 400 stations by 1940, but it did not cover the Atlantic, the Pacific, North Africa, the Mediterranean, or any of the places where American aircraft would soon need to fly. The system had been designed for commercial aviation along established airways, not for military operations across uncharted territory. The military needed the beam, but it needed much more than the beam. It needed systems that worked over water, where there were no stations. It needed systems that worked at long range, where the low-frequency signal faded. It needed systems that could not be jammed by the enemy, which the low-frequency signal most certainly could be. It needed systems that worked for thousands of inexperienced pilots, not the handful of professionals who had spent years learning the quirks of individual stations. The response was an explosion of radio navigation technology that transformed the art of finding your way in the sky from an ear-based skill into a mathematical science. The British developed GI, a hyperbolic navigation system that used the time difference between signals from multiple ground stations to establish a position fix accurate to within a few hundred meters at ranges up to about 350 miles. GI was essential to Bomber Command, allowing British and American bombers to navigate through the perpetual overcast of European skies to their assembly points and initial waypoints over enemy territory. The system used a cathode ray tube display in the aircraft that showed the time difference between the master station's signal and the slave station's signals as blips on a screen. The navigator read the time differences, plotted them on a special chart overlaid with hyperbolic lines, and determined the aircraft's position. It was faster and more precise than anything the low-frequency radio range could provide, but it required a trained navigator, specialized equipment, and printed charts that had to be distributed and updated. The Americans developed LORAN, Long-Range Aid to Navigation, a similar hyperbolic system that operated at longer range, up to 1,400 miles over water. LORAN was the Navy's answer to the problem of navigating across the Atlantic and Pacific, where no radio range stations existed and celestial navigation was the only alternative. It allowed a navigator to establish a fix in minutes, using signals from pairs of stations thousands of miles apart, transmitted at frequencies that bounced off the ionosphere and reached far beyond the line of sight range of the high-frequency systems. LORAN was a gift to every long-range aircraft and every surface ship that operated in the open ocean. It did not provide the continuous guidance of the radio range beam. It gave you a position, not a direction, but a position fix every few minutes, combined with dead reckoning between fixes, was enough to navigate across an ocean and find a destination that was invisible from 100 miles away. The British developed oboe and H-2S, radar-based systems that allowed bombers to identify targets through cloud cover. The Germans developed Knickebein, X-Garette, and Y-Garette, increasingly sophisticated beam-following systems that guided their bombers to British cities with lethal precision, at least until British countermeasures learned to bend and jam the German beams. Each of these systems was more sophisticated than the low-frequency radio range. Each solved problems that the range could not. But none of them replaced the range entirely, because none of them served the same purpose. GE and Loran were position-fixing systems. They told you where you were, but you still had to figure out what to do with that information, using charts and calculations and the skills of a trained navigator. The range was a guidance system. It told you where to go and whether you were going there, and it told you through the most intuitive medium possible, a sound in your ears. Turn left, turn right, straight ahead. No charts required, no calculations needed. No navigator necessary, just a pilot, a pair of headphones, and the ability to distinguish between dit-da and da-dit. The distinction mattered to a 20-year-old pilot with 200 hours of flight time who was lost over England at night in the rain and needed not a position fix, but a direction. Come this way. Follow the sound. The steady tone means you are heading home. During the war, the Army Air Forces deployed radio range stations at bases around the world, extending the domestic network into every theater of operations. Portable range stations were set up at forward airfields in North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific Islands. These were not the permanent four-tower installations of the domestic airways. They were expedient, often improvised, using whatever antenna configuration the signal corps could erect in the time available. But they worked. They gave pilots returning from missions a beam to follow home. The homing beacon, a simpler relative of the radio range, became ubiquitous. A homing beacon was a non-directional transmitter that broadcast a continuous signal on a known frequency. A pilot with a radio compass, a loop antenna that could determine the direction from which a signal was coming, could point his aircraft at the beacon and fly straight to it. This was cruder than flying the beam. It told you what direction to go, but not whether you were on a specific course, but it was simple, cheap, and deployable anywhere. A homing beacon could be set up at a forward airfield in hours, giving returning aircraft a signal to home on. On aircraft carriers, rotating homing beacons guided naval aircraft back to the ship. The carrier's beacon rotated, sending a directional signal that swept around the compass. A pilot with a chronometer could time the intervals between signal peaks and calculate his bearing from the ship. Without a chronometer, he could still get an approximate bearing by the simpler method of listening to whether the signal was getting stronger or weaker. The carrier homing beacon was the naval pilot's lifeline, the signal that connected him to the ship across hundreds of miles of featureless ocean. For the bomber crews flying night missions over Europe, the return to England was often the most dangerous part of the mission. The aircraft were damaged, the crews were exhausted, fuel was low, navigation was uncertain after hours of flying in the dark over blacked-out territory. The radio range stations at the English bases provided a beam, literally a path of sound, that the pilots could follow through the cloud and the darkness to the runway. Pilots who had flown through flak and fighters for 6 hours listened for that steady tone with an intensity that transcended professional skill and approached desperate prayer. The tone meant the beam meant the base meant survival. The system was not foolproof. Aircraft returning from different directions congested the beams. Pilots who were disoriented from hypoxia, from cold, from the accumulated stress of combat, sometimes flew the wrong beam, heading away from the base instead of toward it. The cone of silence, which in peacetime was a useful navigational checkpoint, could be terrifying at night when a pilot who was already uncertain of his position suddenly lost the only signal he had. But the system was better than nothing, and nothing was the alternative. The low-frequency radio range reached its maximum extent during the war. By 1944, over 800 stations were operating worldwide, more than double the pre-war number. The Federal Airways system had expanded from a network connecting major American cities to a global infrastructure supporting military operations on every continent. And then, it began to die. The technology that killed the low-frequency radio range was the VHR omnidirectional range, the VOR, developed during and after the war. The VOR operated at higher frequencies in the VHF band, which gave it three decisive advantages over the low-frequency system. First, VHF signals were far less susceptible to atmospheric interference. The thunderstorm static that could obliterate a low-frequency beam was nearly inaudible on VHF. Second, the VOR was omnidirectional. It provided bearing information in all 360 degrees from the station, not just 4 fixed courses. A pilot could fly any bearing to or from a VOR station, not just the 4 legs defined by the A and N patterns. Third, the VOR displayed its information on a cockpit instrument, a needle on a dial, rather than requiring the pilot to listen to a sound in his headphones. You could see where you were going instead of hearing it. The transition from low-frequency radio range to VOR began in the late 1940s and was largely complete by the early 1960s. The last LF radio range stations in the United States were decommissioned in the 1970s. A few remote stations in Canada lingered into the 1980s, holdovers in mountainous terrain where the beam alignments through valleys were difficult to replicate with VOR courses. But by the time the jet age was fully established, the low-frequency radio range was gone. The 4-course beam, the steady tone, the A and the N, all of it was replaced by a needle on a dial that made navigation easier, more precise, and infinitely less terrifying. The pilots who had flown the beam remembered it. They remembered the hours of concentration, the headphones clamped against their ears, the slight variations in the tone that told them they were drifting, the corrections that brought the hum back to center. They remembered the cone of silence, the sudden disorienting loss of signal that meant they were directly over the station. They remembered the thunderstorms, the crackling static that drowned the tone and left them navigating by dead reckoning in cloud over mountains, hoping that the beam would come back before the terrain arrived. They remembered the fear. Not the fear of combat, that was a different kind, but the fear of being lost, of flying in cloud with no visual reference and only a sound in the headphones to tell them whether they were heading for the airport or the ridgeline. The fear of the sound changing, the steady tone breaking into the dit-da of the A or the da-dit of the N, and not being sure in the moment which direction the correction should go. The fear of trusting your life to a radio signal that was known to bend near coastlines, shift with the snow cover, and vanish in thunderstorms. There is something worth preserving in this story, beyond the technical history. The low-frequency radio range was the first time in the history of aviation that a pilot could fly from one city to another without seeing the ground. That sounds like a small thing now, in an era when aircraft navigate by satellite and land themselves automatically in zero visibility. But in 1930, it was a revolution. It meant that commercial aviation could operate on a schedule, that an airline could promise its passengers that the flight from New York to Chicago would depart at 8 in the morning and arrive at noon regardless of weather. It meant that airmail could be delivered at night, in winter, through the mountain passes that had killed a generation of pilots. It meant that the sky, which had been navigable only in daylight and fair weather, was now navigable always. The system was built by engineers who understood radio physics, and by bureaucrats who understood that aviation would never become a reliable form of transportation until pilots could fly without seeing where they were going. It was operated by pilots who learned to trust a sound the way a blind person trusts a cane, not because the sound was perfect, but because the sound was all they had, and it was better than the alternative, which was no guidance at all. The 400 stations that covered the United States by 1940 and the 800 that covered the world by 1944 were the first electronic infrastructure of the air age. They were the ancestors of every navigation system that followed: VOR, DME, ILS, GPS. The principle was the same in every case: use an invisible signal to tell a pilot where he is and where he needs to go. The technology changed, the frequencies changed, the precision increased by orders of magnitude, but the idea, the conviction that a radio signal could replace the human eye as a means of navigating through space, was born in the 1920s, proved in the 1930s, deployed in the 1940s, and has never been abandoned since. The beam is gone now. No pilot alive today has flown the low-frequency radio range in operational service. The stations are dismantled, the towers taken down, the transmitters scrapped. In a few places, the concrete foundations of the antenna towers survive: 4 concrete pads arranged in a diamond pattern in an empty field, the only physical trace of a station that once defined an invisible highway through the sky. If you know what you are looking at, you can find them. Most people do not know what they're looking at. Most people drive past them without a second glance. But the pilots remember. The ones who are still alive, and fewer survive each year, because the men who flew the beam in the 1930s and 1940s were young then and are very old now. Remember the sound, the steady tone, the A and the N, the cone of silence, the moment when the static cleared and the beam came back, and they knew, with a relief that was physical, that they were on course and heading home. Dit-da, da-dit, steady tone, left, right, straight ahead. That was all it was. A sound in a pair of headphones broadcast from a tower in a field, received by a radio in a cockpit, interpreted by a human ear attached to a human brain that was trying, in the dark, in the cloud, in the ice, to find its way home. It was enough. For 20 years, it was enough. And every pilot who landed safely in weather that would have killed him without it owed his life to a sound that most people have never heard and that no one will ever hear again.